Now, I know I can't speak for everyone, but I know that there has always been a divided opinion within the community about whether Hogs of War would work if it was given a sequel. Of course, Hogs of War Reheated isn't a sequel, but then it also isn't a project that many of us thought could be possible. 20 years after the original game came out, Reheated offers itself as a very promising remaster that could potentially expand on existing content. But how much do you think you know about Hogs of War, specifically the Hogs of War IP? Over the years, there's been plenty of debate in the community about whether or not the IP is owned by Atari, or Sony, or even alternative software. Before I can actually answer that question though, we need to look at what an IP actually is, or at the very least, what it stands for. Intellectual property. It's certainly a term we hear a lot in this age of copyright restrictions on all types of content, most notably of course will be right on this here platform, YouTube. Well, it's the same for games. Once a developer or a publisher has created a game, the game's IP is the term used to describe the game from a legal standpoint. As we have discussed previously, the company and indeed its developers that were making Hogs of War, Gremlins Interactive, were bought out for £24 million by the French-based company Infogrames, who would later merge with and rebrand itself as Atari. Hogs of War was of course published primarily for play on the then high-tech PlayStation 1, which was created and owned by Sony. So you can see where the confusion arises for many people in regards to the game's IP, because there's just so many companies all doing different things at once, all contributing in some way to the game's development. You had the guys who were originally hired at Gremlins for creating and developing the game, Infogrames for publishing the game, and Sony for creating the console that the game could be played on and providing the necessary groundwork for the game to be built upon in relation to hardware and technical specifications. Alright Pins, so get to the point. Who exactly owns the IP for Hogs of War? Well, it's owned by someone who has been there from the very beginning. The beginning of Gremlins Interactive, the beginning of Hogs of War's development, and apparently the person who came up with the original idea for the game. His name is Ian Stewart, and he, alongside Kevin Norburn, founded the company Gremlins Graphics Software in 1983 before founding Gremlins Interactive in the same year. Ian remained as the CEO of Gremlins right up until 1999, and according to Hogs of War lead programmer Jacob Habgood, Ian came up with the core idea for Hogs as mentioned in the Retro Hour podcast back in 2019.
But I mean, the story goes, and I have to sort of say that Ian Stewart does dispute this. So Ian Stewart, the guy who set up Gremlin. The story goes that Ian Stewart went to see Babe, and in a marketing meeting, after having seen Babe, he said, well, you know, we really need to be making games about pigs. People like pigs. So, you know, they were looking at what games were doing well in the charts in those days. And it was actually Command and Conquer, not Worms, that inspired Hogs of War. So the original concept, that we had a 2-page document written by Ed Carlos, who was the designer on Zool as well. It sort of sets out this idea for a game which is basically Command and Conquer with pigs.
Fast forward to 2010 and Ian Stewart has moved on to become the director at Urban Scan Limited, a computer games company that also happens to be based in Sheffield, just like Gremlins Interactive back in the day. From my research, I couldn't actually find much information on Urban Scan, simply that they have made previous games such as Actual Poker on Facebook and Premier Manager 2012. But interestingly, they have also relaunched some of Gremlin's old titles, including Bounder's World, Zool and Monty Mole. Already you can see the link between Urban Scan and Gremlins, what with the old IPs that I'm guessing were brought over by Ian Stewart. Of course, I don't know the full scope involving the holdings of these IPs, including Hogs of War. I don't know the exact details of what is written on the paperwork regarding the Hogs of War IP, but when you put the facts together, the fact that Ian was the CEO of Gremlins, that he is listed in the Hogs of War credits as being the original concept for the game, the fact that he moved or even created the company Urban Scan, which then re-released old Gremlins games, he must be the man responsible for bringing the Hogs IP to Urban Scan. Now, if I'm being professional, then I would formally say that it is Urban Scan that currently owns the IP for Hogs of War, but it's really Ian who deserves all the credit. And so that brings us back to near present day, 2019 in fact, where we find Luke Melville. Many of you will know his name by now, but if you don't, Luke is currently the project lead and programmer on the Hogs of War Reheated project. Now, interestingly, Jacob Habgood, as previously mentioned, was the original lead programmer for the original game, who then went on to become a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. Now, part of Jacob's teaching focused on the PlayStation 4 programming, which in turn led to Luke doing his thesis titled Hogs of War, a case study for remastering classic PlayStation games. Here, Luke focused on creating a methodology for porting PS1 games to a modern working state, using Hogs of War as an example and primarily converting code. So it is here that our two heroes eventually meet. Now, I asked Luke several questions regarding how the Reheated project began, and he said, I approached Jacob about it around the time it came to kick off my thesis, to which he basically said that it would be really hard over the course of a master's thesis, and I like a challenge, so I decided to do it as the target of my thesis. We then approached Ian to see if he was interested, and he attended my thesis milestone briefings, and it snowballed from there. I then went on to ask him what he found most challenging from the project so far, what area or stage of the project he is most excited for, and if there was anything in particular that he'd like to see implemented that wasn't in the original game. He said probably converting the game's application to 64-bit to 32, lots of individual technical challenges, especially in a large, badly maintained code base you don't know very well. Either that or recreating the original PlayStation 1 mass library with very limited documentation to work out how they're used to. Probably just revealing more to the public and seeing what everyone thinks, and terrain deformation would have been really cool but not technically possible back in the day. Currently, the full-time Reheated team consists of Luke, one gameplay programmer, one graphics programmer, and their lead artist, Louisa Diop. Now, some of you will remember her from my previous videos. I've mentioned her artwork before from the early stages of the project. I would highly recommend checking out her ArtStation, as most of her pieces over there are just awesome. Check those out. But as of right now, the team are currently focused on improving the game's renderer and refining gameplay, but unfortunately right now there isn't much else that can be shared, but I imagine it won't be long till we hear and indeed see some new content. The Hogs of War Reheated project was certainly something I never thought could be possible, but it's all thanks to Luke's ambition and drive that enabled it to become a reality. I mean, just think, if Jacob wasn't working at the university, if Ian didn't hold the game's IP, then none of this could be possible. It's funny how life can be so intricately detailed sometimes, how the cards can fall in just the right order to allow something to be possible. Ultimately, Reheated has a long way to go, but I'm just glad that the Hogs of War IP is safe in the hands of someone who knows the game, who understands what it's about, and indeed is always open to listening to the community. If you have any questions or queries or thoughts on the content in today's video, then please let me know in the comments. I always enjoy talking to you guys, so let's get discussion going as we always do, and in the meantime I will catch you all later for the next one. Peace out, everybody.